you want me to do it in French? Because I can do the whole thing in French.
It's like the worst episode of Long Lost Family you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah.
You're quite good at this, David. Like, do you feel you're getting I'm actually I'm getting a wee bit of a
You know what it is?
expert interviewer.
What you want to book for radio is good talkers.
Yeah.
People who can talk, people who are relaxed.
Yeah. Diane, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and what an intro.
Well, that's all right. We try. It's all true, and it's all true. I haven't made any of that up. I can make a bit up if you want me to.
Where would I start? I love the way you said one or two things have been happening in the last year. I mean, it's been an absolute roller coaster.
I was doing so many technology stories, they decided to call me technology correspondent.
I am surrounded by Lego mechs, among other things, because my husband is in a meeting downstairs, and I think that he's decided his meeting is more important.
You with this guy in Greece, and he was Greek.
No, so he was actually Welsh.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought, well, if I write a book, then more people will hear about me and I'll be invited kindly on podcasts like this.
In this episode, we meet a woman whose career is one that can only leave us mere mortals in awe. A career made all the more remarkable for our guest's very humble, yet wonderfully grounded starting point. Dr. Fiona Hill worked as an intelligence analyst for George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and in 2017 was invited to work with a third president and ultimately provide a witness testimony at his impeachment hearing. Dr. Hill's latest book is titled There's Nothing for You Here, a phrase from the dad Alf, an ex-miner, who simply wanted the best for his bright, inquisitive and determined daughter. A bonus point, mind you, for anyone out there who can guess what the missing word is from that phrase. And here's a little clue. Fiona is from County Durham. If I tell you it took 12 months to arrange this chat, you'll appreciate how very much in demand our guest is. And I can also confirm it was most certainly worth the wait. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the Insight with HR Resource podcast, one Dr. Fiona Hill. I have been trying for quite some time to find time, and Fiona's been able to find time for me for this podcast. And finally, we've managed to arrange it. There's so much going on. My schedule looks like nothing compared to this lady's schedule. So I am honoured to have Fiona on this podcast today. We're going to talk about the book, which was published at the back end of 2021, October 2021. It's been a bit of a hit. I've read it. I've actually got the audio version as well. So Fiona's been talking to me whilst walking the dog, whilst jogging. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to dip in to a book that is actually three main parts to it. It's part autobiography. It's part also an analysis of a political structure. And it works, and Fiona can explain that in more detail. However, I'd like to focus on the autobiographical, if I could say the word, element of it, the memoir, and look at the person, because I think in here is a really, really interesting story. Welcome, Fiona.
Oh, thanks so much, Dave. Really great to be with you. And we had success, finally. First time.
And there you are in Washington, talking to us right now. And what I would like to do is, first of all, just ask you a question which might, I don't know whether it's going to be challenging not to answer. What was your earliest memory?
You know, my earliest memory is of my sister being born. I mean, I think a lot of people would probably, say the same sort of thing, some big life event. I remember actually being taken by my grandmother to go and visit my mum in hospital after my sister was born, and being told, this is your baby sister. And actually, I have another big memory around this, which probably, fits into that kind of practicality and harshness of, growing up in the northeast of England. And also my grandmother said, because I pulled out a little magazine, I was 2.5, and my mum would always read me this little magazine. My mum was a nurse, and this was something like Nurse Nancy, some little kind of cartoon book or something that my mum would read to me, kind of the whole having a mother as this sort of symbol idea. And my grandma said, oh, no, your mum won't be able to read that to you now. She's got a new baby. You're going to have to learn to read yourself.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, Well, anyway, it was actually, I think that's kind of what started me off being an early reader, because after that, I would go up and ask people to teach me words so they could read it to me, because I just internalized that my mum wouldn't. Well, I thought, oh, okay. But I do remember that shock. And people say, oh, you can't possibly remember that. But actually, I think it is the case that people, some sort of life shock. I have an earlier vague memory of our chimney being on fire and being carried out by a fireman. But I don't know whether that's, kind of one of those false memories, because people told me I was carried out by a fireman. I know whether I can really remember this, and I've just kind of, figured that out as a, kind of a sort of an image in my head. But that one I definitely remember, because I remember the jolt of surprise. Mum's not going to read me my little magazine, my little comic. See, I'm saying American magazine instead of comic, my comic book.
Well, one of the earliest memories for me was not taking part in the bonfire night fun that my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, was down with my dad in the garden, and my mother was with me, and I've got this memory of having this small dinky toy car.
Right. Yeah, dinky toys.
It was an American style ambulance with little flashing lights, and I would have been about 2.5, so it was about that same time, but thinking, why am I not down there having fun instead of up here? And it was that sort of, why not me? Why can't I do that?
It's that kind of jolt. So maybe it's that sort of first consciousness where you've been excluded for some reason. I suppose negative memories do have that. I mean, it's a positive memory at the same time with the birth of my sister, but, positive, negative, I suppose. Negative, realising that, things have just changed in a rather dramatic fashion.
And one other thing as well, with ourselves, we actually are the same generation. We're in the same year. Some of the earliest Generation X's. So we're not the baby boomers, and we're not the millennials. We're Generation X.
We're lost. The lost generation. We don't know who we are.
That transitional phase, weren't we?
Exactly.
Bits of everything. Taking people who technology just about starting and getting into different areas and different techniques at school that were being experimented on. But one thing with school that I think struck me from your book, that again, there's a connection. 1973.
Right.
I remember because I followed my cousin's football team, which I later sort of wised up from, but I was following Leeds United, and they lost to Sunderland in the FA Cup final.
Yes.
But later in that year, there was a royal wedding. And I think that's something that you and I both were given a challenge by our school to do something about the royal wedding, which is Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips. Tell us a little bit about your challenge with that one.
Yes, so there's been so many royal weddings since, hasn't there? But that was kind of a big one. And of course, by that point, people getting used to things being televised. But as people who are of our generation and generations before might look back, television was a luxury item.
Yeah.
And it wasn't something that every household had, and it certainly wasn't something that our household had. My mum and dad had decided, breaking, generations of family tradition, that they wanted to have their own house. My dad had been actually homeless as a kid, and it had really weighed upon him. And he wanted to have a house of his own, even though, frankly, they couldn't really afford it. But they got one of these, 30-odd year mortgages through a building society, and they decided they were going to make this work. But the house was pretty much empty. There's really nothing much in it. A lot of the time, the utilities were switched off because they couldn't always pay the bills once they'd paid the mortgage. And they certainly couldn't afford a TV, either the license or the license fee or the TV itself. And we were given an assignment. I was 8 years old. And again, it's one of these things I remember very vividly. I mean, we had a radio, but we were supposed to describe the royal wedding, what we saw on television. And I thought, well, I can describe what I hear, but I don't have a television. And my mum, marched off over to the school, and there were some other parents there as well. A lot of, kids in Bishop Auckland, County Durham at that point. People's dads were out of work. Lots of people were in the same sort of situation. They didn't have a lot of money. And they said, well, they can't do this assignment. I mean, is there some, kind of other arrange? Can you arrange for, someone to do a showing of the royal wedding if we've got this assignment of, do we supposed to draw a picture, write an essay, describe it in detail? And, the teacher, said, oh, well, sorry, I suppose they'll fail. I mean, how callous. And so I tried to kind of basically improvise. I got hold of, my dad had a little portable radio that used to listen to the football on, probably like the Leeds United and Sunderland match, because I remember him screaming with joy when Sunderland beat Leeds, in the final. And there was some neighbours across the way who had a television, and not just any television. They didn't have a black and white one; they had a colour television.
Oh, wow!
And I snuck along on the grass near their house and started watching it through the window. do it on the radio. But unfortunately, they saw that someone was out there. I don't think they saw that it was me, and they closed the curtains.
So they're aware they were being snooped upon. So
Yes, there's like that feeling of, oh, somebody out there, what's going on? Because I was too embarrassed to ask them if I could go in, because it was just sort of, the whole thing was mortifying, and Mum and Dad didn't want to ask because they're just, on principle, my mum just wanted to, but I was trying to improvise because I thought, well, I don't want to fail this assignment. Have you were a little kid, you don't want to be ostracized. I don't know I can't remember what the other kids in school did, but at least I was able to describe in vivid detail the bits that I saw in those first parts of watching, so it was very heavy on the whole early part of the ceremony, a little lighter touch on the rest of it, but I was able to draw a picture, and I remember drawing the picture of Mark Phillips in his uniform with his hat on and kind of princess on and everything. So there you are. I think improvisation is the key.
Yeah, and with the determination to get it done, and not, okay, you could say that there's a fear of, I know you just talked about fear for the BBC Reith lectures, but there was a fear there of being left out.
Yes, exactly.
Obviously, that you hadn't been able to see it because you didn't have television, and maybe the guilt or the shame of that. But that really wasn't any guilt or shame, because your father was he at that stage?
He was a hospital porter.
But
look, and if we look back to the he'd been a miner. Miner for 15 odd years, 16 years, and the mines had all closed down. So he'd gone down the mines when he was 14 in County Durham, and this was the whole period, when he went down, was the nationalisation of the industry, the creation of, the whole nationalised coal industry, and he went down the mines in, I think it would be 1946, so immediately after the war, when you've just had the nationalisation, 1946, 1947, because he was born in 1932, with the Depression and everything. But then, great period of work in the 50s, 60s come along, and all the mines start to close, and he starts moving from mine to mine. And then eventually, all the local mines have gone. There's a limit to how far he can go on his bicycle, because my dad didn't have a car, and if he, buses and things, all the villages were, imploding because the mines were closing and all the work around them. At that point in County Durham, he got a job briefly in the steelworks at Walsingham, also a brickworks, but these were all sort of temporary jobs. And in the steelworks, somebody fell in one of the vats of molten steel, and that really put Dad off, as you can imagine. It's pretty dangerous, nasty work, and it was somebody he knew, and I think he was quite traumatized by that. And then he found a job in Bishop Auckland Hospital, but he was still living up at that point when the hospital job came along, 9-10 miles away, and he would cycle every day to commute, and that's where he met my mum. But hospital porters, along with cooks and kind of cleaners in the hospital, were at the lowest rung of the economic ladder there. And we're now seeing that in the UK again, with hospital workers and nurses going on strike. People were pretty much on the breadline, on the poverty line with those jobs, grave diggers. This is when you get into the 70s, these are all the people who are always on strike because their wages are so low that they can't make ends meet. But Mum was a nurse. She was a midwife. But as soon as my sister came along, after, kind of a year or so of trying to work, she realised she couldn't, because there was no healthcare, rather childcare in the healthcare system. And my mum couldn't afford to pay for childcare, because she would have been paying for childcare what she was actually earning. And so she decides to, basically come out of the workforce, and we basically plunged down there to, well below the poverty line. But Dad wanted to keep working. There was, at that period, again, this is, kind of one of the things I'm constantly thinking about. Most people want to work. They want to have a chance, to have a job. And Dad just couldn't imagine not working, so he would just put in every hour he possibly could to expand his shifts. But it didn't extend to buying televisions and, basically having a car, a telephone, or anything like that.
There is a connection, isn't there, between the not least just the strikes and the potential threat of power cuts that we're seeing over here, and the warning signs of that. But also that poverty that you talk about, the salaries, the earning of people in the front line, and the reason why they're going on strike. And one of the things I heard recently was the fact that there are hospitals that have actually got food banks in the cafeteria.
Yeah, no, seriously, we've gone back full circle to the 1970s.
Yeah.
Because the period that you and I are talking about, the people thinking about the winter of discontent, and but why was that? Because public sector salaries were so low. Yeah. And I had free school meals, although my dad had he turned our back garden into, basically an allotment. My granddad had an allotment. People were always like growing their own food and just, trying to make ends meet, and would share food with each other as well. I mean, food banks now are filling in for that because people, although actually in Bishop Auckland people have allotments, there's been a big revival of allotments and people, growing their own food, and I'm sure, all the way across County Durham. But and then there was the cooperative, and obviously, but people really were trying to pull together to basically get through everything. And we've gone back full circle. It's really disturbing. I mean, this is the impact, unfortunately, of all of the austerity policies after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. I talk about all of this in the book. And, basically decades of not really paying attention sufficiently to the emergence of these huge gaps and inequality and in health and well-being as well. I mean, basically, in some parts of the northeast of England, people are very well aware of this. You've got 50% childhood poverty. And we had that when we were growing up. And it hasn't changed. It's in many respects. I mean, there's been a diminution, but you've basically got entrenched now child poverty and incredibly poor health outcomes, which was improving. Actually, health overall was improving, back in the period when we were kids, because there was still a lot of investment in the National Health Service and obviously not as much demands on it.
It is scary where we're looking at where we are right now, I think. But obviously, going back to the younger Fiona and your school life, and obviously your determination to be able to do well. Obviously, you were a bright child, good, strong family around you. And you did very well at school. You passed your 11 plus. Something else?
Yeah, I don't know whether you did that as well, David. Sorry, just a bit.
Yeah, I did the 11 plus.
Because it was getting phased out in a lot of the schools. I mean, you and I were products of that real expansion of education and educational opportunity that came about actually in the 50s as well as in the 1960s, really taking off when we were born and start to move into schooling. And of course, the comprehensive school system also emerges in that same time frame when we're born, and it's expanding out across the country. And I was in the last cohort of people, particularly at my school. Some of the other primary schools in Bishop Auckland, I think it might have already been phased out, but my school at the time, Etherley Lane, we were the last year that took the 11 plus. But I mean, it wasn't to go to a grammar school at that point. I think it was just for the possible streaming in the comprehensive school, but it was also used by the headmaster of my school, who'd had a long track record of sending kids to the local grammar schools, but also to some of the fee-paying private schools that would give children scholarships. I ended up being actually offered a scholarship on the basis of the 11 plus to go to the local girls' school. It really was kind of not so local up in Durham, but I wasn't able. That's part of the whole story. I wasn't able to take it because my parents couldn't afford the associated costs.
All the sports equipment, all the uniforms,
the uniforms, the bus fares, because I mean, obviously I wouldn't get any subsidised bus fares to private school. It was so sometimes opportunity comes along. That was a great opportunity, but you can't take it because you don't have the wherewithal. I mean, in the book I call that the infrastructure of opportunity, and sometimes the literal infrastructure is missing. The means of getting to some place, transportation, for example, the pathways that would get you to an opportunity.
Yeah, and whereas I went to a grammar school, and
yes, because they were still in parts of the country, the grammar schools were all, the system just kept on going.
Yeah, and I was invited back to a school prize giving not so long ago, which was a bit of a shock. I think they found me on LinkedIn, and it was just a complete surprise. They'd obviously not checked my school record. But anyway, glossing over that, I might have mentioned that. The beauty as well of the comprehensive is that it was forward thinking, and you had a number of people would come and give inspirational talks. One was one of your MPs, Derek Foster.
That's right. Yeah.
Quite an influence on you and your outlook. Can you perhaps talk about how Derek?
He did. I mean, he was an amazing person, actually. I mean, he's sadly passed away. Went on to become the chief whip of the Labour Party. But the main thing about him was he was somebody who'd also come from a very deprived background. He'd had a lot of family tragedies and deprivations, and he'd really been turned around too by a combination of education and also, interesting, the Salvation Army that had sort of stepped in at a real low point in his life. And this, part of the story of County Durham is that infrastructure of self-help and mutual assistance. that often, religious organizations play a role in as well. The Quakers and lots of the foundations, they set up the Salvation Army, the Catholic Church with the St. Vincent and Paul, societies, for example. My father, when he was homeless, I mean, they benefited from, funding from all kinds of things, the Women's Institute, the Boys Brigade, the Rotary Club, you can go on and on. There's always somebody there who, will try to step in, to help if, they see something that needs to be addressed. And this was the story of Derek Foster. A combination of education and the Salvation Army had given him direction. It enabled him to go on to university. He'd gone to Oxbridge, he'd studied PPE, politics, philosophy and economics. And he had then dedicated himself to education in the region. He'd been the head of education for the local education authorities. He'd grown up in Sunderland. And when he became the MP for Bishop Auckland, which wasn't his home area, but it's very close, obviously, in County Durham, he dedicated himself to trying to give local kids the sense that they could achieve things as well. And he'd come to the school, when I was in my teens, trying to sort of think about the future. And I've just been really struck by what a lovely person he was, how approachable he was, how kind, and how he just basically said, look, you can change your circumstance of education. But he also said something which has never left me, that education is a privilege. And if you have an education, you've got to do something with it. So it wasn't just education for education's sake, but this is something practical and a tool. And if you got an education, you've got to give back, which is what he was doing. So he was living and emulating the things that he was preaching. He was a practicing what you preach person.
Yeah. And as much as the primary school had seen potentially, your comprehensive had seen potentially in you, and I think there was a direction towards Oxford, that there was an opportunity for you to perhaps excel at one of the better known universities. Well, of course, there's, other universities are available, and Durham is a very good one, I have to say that.
Yeah. And St Andrews, where I ended up going as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think there was a suggestion that you should put yourself forward, and I think you had one or two friends who were with you who were offered the opportunity but didn't take it up, but you decided you'd push yourself forward and take the exam. Yeah,
it was this a learning experience, and it was also quite humiliating, to be frank. But those things, if you overcome them, they certainly make you more resilient. And it really was an eye-opening experience, because I hadn't realised, I don't think anybody at the school had really thought through the fact that we had no preparation whatsoever for something like this. We didn't even know what it entailed. Nobody in the faculty at the school, the teachers, had been to Oxbridge. We did have my English teacher, who was a graduate of Durham University, taught at university for a while. He was a doctor and had, kind of come back into the school, Dr. Marshall system in County Durham to kind of give back again, somebody very much like Derek Foster. And, it turns out that, of course, that there's an exam. And in private schools and grammar schools, not all grammar schools, though, it must be said, depends on where you are, they have a whole set of special preparation for this.
Yeah.
And I basically did it cold. They'd got hold of an exam paper from kind of couple of years previously. And I had no idea, what to say I would read at Oxford. I didn't even know what that meant, honestly. And but I remembered, Derek Foster done PPE, so why not? But actually, nobody really knew what philosophy was. And there was no economics classes, Bishop Barrington Comprehensive School. And, politics was all the things that were happening around us. And, but I thought, well, at least I'll try. And I do remember, feeling that hot rush, where everything goes black, when you pick up this paper. And I was sitting in the, one of the rooms with the teacher supervising me, as if I could cheat, there was like nothing around me. And I just remember thinking, oh God, what does all this mean? And, the one thing that I remember from the paper, and I just remember also the paper was very crinkly, and, I was worried about tearing it, and, had to write all this, these essays. About Schopenhauer and his theory of the will. And I thought, Schopenhauer? Is he a composer? And I thought, no, this is philosophy, of course not. But Schopenhauer, there's something in the back of my mind, I thought, sounds like a composer. And I thought, well, he must be German. Theory of the will, okay, German, theory of the will. What do I know about theory of the will? Do I know anything about the theory of the will? And, thinking about willpower. And then, I had read, as, some rather precocious, teen War and Peace in its entirety, in English, of course, just to be very clear.
That is impressive.
And I remember that Tolstoy had this whole wittering on about the will in it that I'd been a little bored by, because I was hoping to rush on to Natasha at the dance and, all the other kind of exciting teenage girl, like attractive parts of Tolstoy. He's actually quite, a good author for teenage girls in parts of this. And but I then was trying to remember back, what was he saying about this? The bits I was, rushing over to get to the main action. And I was dredging back in my brain. Eventually, I started just talking about what I'd remembered from Tolstoy and just thought, oh, God, well, at least I wrote something. And then, of course, I'd not passed. But they invited me in for an interview. So they must have seen something in my, desperate attempts to, respond to the essay questions. And then that was a bit that got really embarrassing, because I had to go down to an interview at Oxford. They didn't pay for me to go down either. I had to, break into my savings from all part-time jobs and things to get a train fare. Nobody told me what to expect. I had no idea. I had no idea what I was doing. Nothing. I mean, the whole thing was just, for kids, we don't have the software programming for all of this, if you want to use that as an analogy. We just don't know, what we're doing in this. There's no preparation, because it's a whole world that has been manufactured.
An alien world.
Selection. Yes, it's completely and utterly alien. And this has taught me an awful lot about access to education. Just because somebody's, bright, they pass their exams, they might not have basically the conception at all about what they're dealing with. And this is why standardized tests, the algorithms that are built into this are very biased, because of course they're produced by the people who are setting these up and following their own neural and knowledge and life pathways. And most people are outside of all of that. And I think this is one of the problems that we're facing with higher education. The opportunity is there for people, but there's all this kind of like big debate about selection and not looking for people from diverse backgrounds. But an awful lot of people are just not in the mix because they just don't know. I knew nothing about Oxford and Cambridge, and nobody around me really did either.
Although you did recognise somebody who was sat alongside waiting to go for their interview. In fact, I called this little section for myself as an aid memoir, Schopenhauer and Schadenfreude.
Yes, exactly. Yes, because there was a girl from County Durham who I'd met on a school exchange. I mean, one of the great things about County Durham that they continue to emphasise is arts, culture and education, even at the hardest of times. And somehow, the county had tried to retain those budgets for that. Yeah. And, for kids like me from poor backgrounds, there was ability to play music, musical instruments, choirs, orchestras, cultural exchanges, going to art museums. And I'd gone on a school exchange for the whole of the county to Tübingen in Germany. And there'd been, again, kids representing all kinds of different schools, including some of the private schools and some of the grammar schools that were still in existence. And the girl that I saw was from one of the grammar schools in another part of County Durham. And I remember on the exchange, because this is the exchange when I realised I was working class and poor, because people kept asking me, where are you from? What school did you go to? What did your dad do? And then as soon as I'd say, some of them would go, oh, and, kind of wander off. And I thought, what did I say?
Yeah,
you're not. Yeah, I didn't get to finish the conversation. I thought we were just getting to know each other, and I realised no, I was being categorised and put in a box, not their sort. This is County Durham. We're all from County Durham. What's the matter with them? I thought, because when I was growing up, I didn't really know anybody who wasn't working class. I mean, they might be middle class, but they were all, we had some people at the same school. Nobody, would behave like that. And then, here we were being discriminatory on this exchange, and this was one of the girls who stuck her nose up at me, and I couldn't remember her name, honestly, because I don't think I'd got that far with her, because she just wandered off before I even got to know her. But I didn't really see her on the exchange either, because she kept away from me. But she said, oh, my goodness, Fiona Hill, what are you doing here? And I immediately thought, oh, what am I doing here? Yes. And it just kind of went downhill from there. It's like that scene in Billy Elliot, when he shows up. It's such a, I mean, of course, Robbie, who wrote Billy Elliot's from County Durham, based it on the story of Sir Tom Allen. Actually, from Seaham, who becomes the great opera singer, but translates it into ballet. And a kid from County Durham, same sort of time frame, who goes off and has these big auditions, and people are like, "What are you doing here? What right do you have to be there?" And that just reinforced the idea that there are some institutions at that time. I mean, there's been a lot of change in Oxford and Cambridge since then, that create so many barriers to entry. But they're really missing out And we're missing out on the potential of so many people around who, if given a chance, would absolutely excel. And it's the diversity of talent and perspective. And this is why, frankly, the United States and the UK are in so much trouble, because they're excluding large swathes of the population from opportunity. And it's an opportunity for all of society, not just for those individuals.
And around about this time as well, and forgive me if I get my timeline slightly mixed up, but there was a bit of a sage moment from an Uncle Charlie.
Yes, yes. It's really Cousin Charlie. I mean, as I'm sure everybody knows in the Northeast, I mean, you've probably got the same thing.
Everybody knows Cousin Charlie.
Family, friends, and older relatives often called uncle and aunt, whether they actually are your physical, biological uncle and aunt. Because I have another Uncle Keith, but he's no relation. He'd always introduce himself as Uncle Keith, no relation, just super close family friend. But Uncle Charlie was my dad's cousin, but he was an older cousin. So he was of another, generation. And he was the person who basically encouraged me to go and study Russian, because it's the time of the war scares of the 1980s. Although, I mean, I think, at the time we all could feel that there was something happening, but we didn't know all the details. It's only later you realise actually we were on the brink, unfortunately, of a kind of a nuclear confrontation in 1983. We could feel it, but we didn't know what was happening.
Yeah.
And, so you have the declassification of the information later. Yeah, but you have threads the day after, all of the popular culture filled with that, campaign for nuclear disarmament, Greenham Common Women, there's all this kind of stuff happening. And some people weren't paying attention. I was paying a lot of attention. I had friends and relatives who were off in the army, so they were off there, on the edge of the Cold War. We had the Falklands War. I knew people who'd gone to fight there. So it all, seemed, fairly real. And a chance encounter with Uncle Charlie down the town in Bishop Auckland on a Saturday. He's talking to my dad and they're talking about all this. Uncle Charlie had fought in World War II. He'd been in the Atlantic convoys and the Merchant Marine, going to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, and he'd had all this wild, crazy adventures during World War II that we used to get, wilder every time you heard them, and you couldn't believe them, but actually a lot of them were true because wild things happened, in those periods. And he looks at my dad, looks at me, and says, "Well, you're good at languages, Fiona. Maybe you should go off and study Russian and figure out why the Soviets are trying to bloody well blow us up."
Because they've been an ally through the World War.
Yeah, they were an ally in World War II. I don't get it. And he was, quite sympathetic to the whole, idea of still being allied. So he couldn't figure it out. And I thought, yeah, I could do that.
Yeah.
Why I go so blasé thinking, yeah, I could do that. I could try to do that. Yeah, I could try. I mean, I've gone to Germany.
Team building, can do attitude. Yeah. I really like it.
Right. Yeah, I thought, okay, I could try to do that. Nobody said I couldn't. Uncle Charlie's saying, yeah, why not? And then Uncle Charlie starts to help try to find ways of figuring that out. And I got money from the Durham Miners Association in 1984 during the miners' strike that had come via the miners of Donbass in Ukraine, the place that's been absolutely devastated as we're speaking, basically in the fighting between Russia and Ukraine, the place that's been completely mauled in this horrible carnage of war. But back in the time of the miners' strike in 1984, miners from around the world in solidarity with the British miners raised money. And the miners of County Durham and the miners of Donbass had some links going back to the 1920s. Representatives of the Durham Miners Association went out to Donbass in the 1920s. And they'd sent money, and my Uncle Charlie told us that there was basically a fund that had, kind of was set up for children of former miners, because by that point most people were former miners, for education. And I could apply to a bursary there. And I mean, we didn't know how to do it. And Uncle Charles would just get on the bus and go to Red Hills, the Pitman's Parliament in County Durham. But you better go with your dad because he's the one who was the miner. So, and Dad was like, I don't know if I've still got all my, old, pay books and things, because you'd have to prove he was a miner. So Dad, went back home and started scuffling around trying to see if he could, find some of his old mining stuff. And we went on the bus. Went there and went in, and there's in a little waiting room in an inquiries place.
Yeah. And
she was shocked. Uncle Charlie was right, and and I got some money. In fact, I think they just handed it over to me as long as I proved, what I need to do for eventually for a language program. It wasn't like the next day, but it was as I discovered that I could do a summer language program learning Russian, and I needed that then to to go on to university. I needed to do this before before I went.
And what drew you to St Andrews? Which is
it was partly chance, and I think that a lot of this, when you talk to people who come from kind of backgrounds, they don't know an awful lot about what they're going to do and where they're going to go. And I mean, obviously, lots of good universities in County Durham, as you said. But I kept being told by my teachers, well, you'll probably have to live at home. I mean, not if you went to Sunderland or Newcastle, but if you go to Durham, you'll have to live at home because you know, close enough that you probably just have to take the bus there. And I thought, well, that's not going to be, kind of much of a university experience, so living at home with my mum and dad and trying to take the bus up all the time. And my mum and dad said, oh, you should really, get the full university experience, and County Durham would pay for it, based on means testing. Mum and dad had no money whatsoever to put towards this. And so I started kind of looking around in the library and other places if I could see if I could get the brochures of universities, and there were a few that the teachers had collected and put in the sixth form room at Bishop Barron. We had a sixth form then, which is pretty small. And in those things, there was a brochure of St Andrews, and it was in colour, and everything else was in black and white. And I thought, oh,
great marketing.
Exactly, great marketing. And they had some colour photographs. I thought, oh my God, this place is beautiful. And so there was the Oxford debacle. I was obviously that was done. I didn't get in. Not a surprise. And my mum and my sister and I decided that we'd go to St Andrews, for a long weekend. And we took the train and several buses. I don't remember, it was a bit of a complicated way to get there because we were trying to do it cheaply. We all shared one B&B when we got there, on a shoestring. But the amazing thing was that as we got out of the bus station, trying to figure out where we would go, we weren't really sure the university was even open because it was a holiday. We ran into another person who was going to be one of my great mentors at St Andrews, John Sullivan, who was a lecturer in the Russian department, a very kind of senior figure there in the university. And he heard us as we were milling around the bus, but we were talking quite loudly, wondering where to go. And he was from Yorkshire. And he kind of comes up and says, why are you there? Hello there. What's up? It's like great Yorkshire accent. Yeah. I hear some other Northerners, what are you doing here? Can I help? You sound lost. And we explained, and he was like, oh my goodness, well, I am the Russian department. Wow. And he had the keys to the department in his pocket. He said, come on, we'll go to your, place you're staying and I'll show you around. And that was it. I was like, I'm going there. I'm going here. And he told me that he would help to, explain to me how to navigate the application process as well. Because look, this is what people need. They need some help. Yeah. Again, this is what you work on, right? It's like, how do you make the most of talent? How do you enable people to reach their potential on anything? Vocational training. People just need some help. They need to know that things are out there, that there is the availability of this opportunity. It's not like if you're in a vacuum, that's where you are. You don't know about things. And that's really what spurred me off to write the book with more of a memoir, because I wanted to tell these stories. So it wasn't just a clinical description of why we're in such a crisis right now, economically and politically, in the US and the UK, because there's so many parallels, but how a story would illustrate this. And initially, I'd wanted to do it thematically, but it ended up more following the chronology of my life and career, because it just made for a better narrative. Because telling stories is what we do in the Northeast, isn't it? We just tell a lot of stories to each other.
Well, that's when you do learn from everybody's stories. That goes back to the earliest possible time of human life. Thinking about, the education, you got your MA in St Andrews, and then obviously you've had experience. And again, the timeline might be slightly skewed here, but you did spend time in Russia.
I did, yes.
Made a correlation between parts of your experience of the Northeast and the way that culture and how the communities were with parts of Russia and your experiences there, but also you at a later time of going to Russia, I think you were actually sitting in a room with Vladimir Putin. So you've sort of seen several sides of Russia, not only the academic side to actually understand the community and its history, but also actually seeing it close up and personal, more than Russians themselves.
Yeah, look, there's nothing like first-hand direct experience to, help you see things in the world. And often the way that experience is processed depends on where you're coming from in the first instance. So the first time that I went to the Soviet Union, as it was then, was in 1987. While I was at St Andrews, it was equivalent of being sort of junior year abroad. It was between my, as they call it in America, parlance, but also, at the end of my third year. St Andrews is a 4-year term, so rather 4-year course of education. It was the end of my third year before my final year. And I mean, I was just immediately struck by how similar it was to the northeast of England. Again, might be counterintuitive to most people, but again, think about what the north of England is like. It is basically full of nationalised industry, or certainly was when I was growing up. Because after World War II, the commanding heights, as they call it, of British industry had been devastated, and the state had to step in. British Steel, British Coal, British Rail, British Shipbuilding, and everybody I knew worked for the state. My dad had gone from British Coal to British Steel, briefly to a brickworks, but I don't know who that fell under, but then in the National Health Service, so British Health, basically nationalised industry. Very few people who worked in the private sector, might be the local plumber or electrician, a couple of people with a small shop, for example, a couple of family members at a corner shop, but that's it, or farmers, so I go to the Soviet Union, it's just one big nationalised industry, and it's also falling apart, and the shops are all empty. The shops are empty at home as well. The shops are empty at home because there's no demand, because people have lost their jobs, massive unemployment, closing down. In the Soviet Union, loads of demand, but the whole system has broken down, but the supply side isn't working. So I start thinking about all this. It really, opens my mind, but I'm making connections and parallels that most people wouldn't do. And then, as you said, fast forward, I end up working, first of all, at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. When I get there to go to grad school, and I'm doing technical assistance projects, I moved to the Brookings Institution, where I still am now, and I start doing research on why things didn't turn out as people expected in Russia. And a lot of it comes back to the stuff that I'd internalized from home. If you've had decades of working for the state and no entrepreneurial initiative being encouraged, and people aren't being educated for these kinds of jobs, that's going to be much more difficult. And if there isn't that experience of private property, home ownership, and all of that had to be created from scratch in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is going to be a huge wrenching dislocation, not something that happens all kind of smoothly. And Vladimir Putin's the product of that. He comes right out, he's born in 1952, and his whole experience is of the Soviet Union after World War II. And he is a Soviet guy, the way that he thinks of the world, as well as then infused with this sort of deeper, mystical almost versions of Russian history that he's kind of created for himself. And being able to see him close up and observe him told me an awful lot about him. And I wrote a book with a colleague called Mr. Putin Operative in the Kremlin, did sort of 2 editions of that while I was at Brookings, trying to explain Putin in the context of his life and the way that he would see the world, very much similar to the way we're talking too, because we're all products of our environments. So what was the environment that shaped Putin? That was what the book was trying to get at. So how then does it help us to understand how he thinks?
Yeah. And in a couple of the observations from that meeting, the humanized the man, because I think that's another situation we find ourselves in with everything that's going on in the world. You can overlay all sorts of attributes to an individual that makes them almost like this sort of mythical creature that is causing.
Yeah.
But he's a man with eyesight problems because cards had to be written to a certain size, and he'd staged.
Yes, I've got my glasses on my head. Yep, same thing.
But the same position.
Because I could read his cards; they were so large.
but also the fact that he had to stage the way that the meeting would look, so that you didn't look overplayed by anybody, and you were there for a particular reason, and it just, to me, that speaks more of a lack of confidence than an overconfidence, and it's somebody that has to control everything to be able to.
And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. Absolutely right, David. Absolutely right. I mean, that's it. We have to remember everyone's a human being, and everybody is shaped by various forces, and a lot of people are much more vulnerable than they might appear.
Yeah.
And we see now with Putin, he's kind of acting out his fantasy of history. One of the chapters in the book that Clifford Gaddy, my colleague, and I wrote, Mr. Putin, is called The History Man. And, because we were looking at different facets of his personality, it was really from these times sitting next to him and talking to all the people around him, we realized he was obsessed with Russian history, his version of it. And I'm equally obsessed with the history of the northeast of England, right? But I'm sure a lot of people are. We kind of think we know what we know about our history. And Putin avails himself of all these documents that are in the Kremlin archives and various books, but he's not looking at world history. He's not putting it in a context. He's looking at it from one particular vantage point. And I was trained as a historian, and that can be very risky, because you're looking for it's confirmation bias. You know, you have a particular bias, and you're just looking for the material and the facts and the figures that bolster the view that you already have, which is what he was doing. And that's, you know, how I picked up on all of that from these encounters with him, the way that he talk about things. Well, Mr. Putin, the history man, has become an absolute danger to all of us, because he's trying to impose his view of Russian history and therefore European and world history on all of us through this war in Ukraine. He's saying that Ukraine doesn't exist. Yeah. And look, you know, when we grew up in the northeast of England, and, you know, for people listening to this, just think, you know, at one point, the northeast of England was under the Roman Empire. We have Hadrian's Wall. Yeah. You know, so if we pick our point in history, should we be part of Rome still? And then we were part of the Danish Empire, Danelaw. For hundreds of years, it was under Rome, and then, you know, equally under the Danes. Northumbria was a standalone entity, also for generations within the United Kingdom. It was ruled by the Prince Bishops of Durham, for example. We've got a complicated history, and people have come from all over. All of the Irish and the Welsh and the Scots and the people from other parts of England that have come to work in the industry during the kind of the big flourishing of the Northeast in the late 1800s and early part of the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, there's really so many places have these complex histories, and Putin's trying to sort of impose one particular view on this. And that's really what this war in Ukraine is all about, is the right for Ukrainians to just say who they are and where they want to be and where you know, they want to go in the future, not to have somebody else dictating it for them.
One of the things that knowledge and that passion that you have for history and for seeking connections between situations that have been historic but also current and contemporary political was a great help to the White House, because they've obviously called on your expertise, and that's seen you work for the administration of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and a certain Mr. Trump. So with those three in mind, just as a sort of a little bit of a segue break, very quick break, could you perhaps sum them up in as few words as you can, what each one was like?
Obviously, they're all very different.
Pulled out the pin and lobbed in the grenade.
Yeah. No, but it's interesting. So George W. Bush was actually the most appealing in terms of personality, because he comes across as a very warm, genuine person. Now we can, you have to put aside here invasion of Iraq and all kinds of horrors that, happened on his watch here, spurred on by, the great tragedy of 9/11, of course. But he was also very intellectually curious. I mean, he got a bad rap for people making questions about, his intellectual impairment, because he obviously did have at some point dyslexia or some other, learning disorder. But he was the kind of person who enjoyed the interaction, asked really good questions, and you could tell was learning as he spoke. He wasn't really one for reading everything through, but he would actually let his briefings go on for far longer than they needed to, because he was trying to figure things out. And again, he was warm and he was friendly. He called me Blair's girl, actually, because of my accent. He said, "Where's that accent from? You are an American, right?" And I said, "Yes, I'm a naturalized American, so otherwise I wouldn't be here." And I explained it was from County Durham. And he said, "I've been there, haven't I?" And I said, "Yes, you have." Yes, when you went to visit Tony Blair, you flew over my parents' house in your helicopter, went to Sedgefield and you visited. And I said, they waved at you. So it's kind of, because he's got that sort of jokey, personality. He said, "Yeah, I'm sure. I remember seeing them in that garden, right?" And I said, yes, of course. Because he's just friendly and warm and curious. Yeah. So, that's, take with that what you will in personality. It was very enjoyable briefing him. Some of the other people were out with him, not so much. I mean, and he didn't always, pay attention the way that you would like and follow the direction. And he obviously made quite a lot of decisions, including the invasion of Iraq, which, pretty horrific. But anyway, Barack Obama.
You had a working relationship. You had a
great working relationship with him. Yeah, insofar as, it's not like I saw him every day kind of thing. And I was a briefer from the National Intelligence Council at the time. Same with Barack Obama, because I was there for the transition. Barack Obama, very cerebral, as people would expect, read everything in advance, heard you out, asked a couple of questions, and that was that. And, he would adopt a pose with his hand on his chin, looking a little like Rodin's The Thinker, the sculpture, clothed, of course, but really kind of penetrating gaze, You had no idea whether he was thinking, you guys are idiots, I have no idea what you're talking about, or this is really all wrong. You know, he was always very respectful, but at real distances. And then, you know, Trump, no interest whatsoever in being briefed. Not interested in reading it, not interested in asking you any questions, just wanted you to go away. And it was just a real challenge trying to find any way of working in, you know, kind of a group in tandem with others to, you know, get him to get the information that he obviously needed to function as a president on things like foreign policy. And he was all about how someone looked, you know, kind of what he knew about their background. He just was not interested, you know, unless you were a billionaire. You know, he would listen to people from the intelligence community, particularly if he thought that they were badasses, as he would think, you know, that they were kind of people who'd done something, you know, really, you know, of note. So he had a very, well, you know, I think everybody at this point has pretty much figured this out. I find it exhausting to talk about, honestly, because it was just such a challenge, just trying to, we'd have to come up with so many creative ways of trying to get information to him. And I mean, I never took it personally. I thought, well, that's just the way this guy is. And he's not going to listen to me. I'm just some middle-aged woman with a funny accent. And it doesn't matter. I've written a book and I know all this stuff. He doesn't care. Who am I?
Did you think you were a secretary at one point?
Oh yeah, I mean, he thought everybody was a secretary. If you had the title secretary, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, I mean, you know, you're a secretary one way or another. And a lot of us, you know, did have to take notes. I mean, everybody was staff. And, you know, one of the classic examples of this is Rex Tillerson, who'd been the CEO of ExxonMobil, you know, the world's, at the time, you know, largest company, highest valuation company. He tantamount to being God in, you know, the industrial circles. And he'd retired and he'd been asked to come in to be Secretary of State, and immediately just got dealt with the stuff. It wasn't even interested in what Rex Tillerson had to say about dealing with Putin and you know, making deals in the energy industry. It just wanted him to be there, you know, figuring out how to make the connections for him. It was all about Trump.
And as we know, it all unraveled, as history will tell. And you, in 2019, were called to Trump's impeachment and to give evidence. And that, a cursory look at that would think, oh yeah, okay, so it was a meeting you had to go to, but the pressure, the stress that comes with that, because the whole world's looking in on this situation, and you've moved from a position of being well known in your own field, certainly well respected in your experience and what you can bring to bear, but suddenly being judged on the way you look, on your accent, in a completely different way by a much bigger audience. How did you cope with that? I mean, how is that experience must have been almost life-changing.
Well, it obviously was a life-changing experience. I was somebody who was used to working behind the scenes and, you know, just getting on with it, just doing the job that I needed to do. And I wasn't looking to be out in the spotlight anyway. As you said, I was pretty well known in my own field. I mean, you know, there are many people who are, you know, well known in the Russian field, and I had no desires to be, you know, out there in any larger way. I mean, the reason that I went into the administration was because I'd already had all this experience. I knew people who were going in there, and there was a job needed to be done because the Russians had interfered in the election, and there was all this. It was a massive threat to national security. And when I was asked, I thought, well, if I say no to this, am I just going to sit in the sidelines the whole time and not take responsibility? I couldn't live with myself when I'd been asked and just turned it down. You know, I always remember my family, you know, my dad was in the mines and all my grandparents, everything. If there was an accident, you went and helped. And this felt like an accident, right? You don't just stand around waiting for somebody else to do something. So I thought, okay, well, I've got to go and do something. And just keep my head on my shoulders. And that's actually how I initially approached this. I thought, okay, well, look, I knew that something, you know, really awful was happening. And I needed to step up and tell people what I knew. And I believed in congressional oversight, and I was doing my job, and clearly a lot of other people were doing something else entirely. And I needed to speak up, and people were being maligned, and people's lives are on the line. And you see what's happening in Ukraine now. I mean, that's a direct line from all of this stupidity when the Russians think that we don't care about Ukraine. And our national security was being imperiled in the United States and elsewhere too. But I was going to have to explain myself, and I had to have a lawyer, I had to have a whole group of people around me. But, you know, the main thing was to really prepare. So I had to prepare for it. And as you said, I mean, the ridiculous things, a lot of the preparations were into how I was going to present myself. Because as a woman, this is when you realize it kind of gets in the way. Because people scrutinize what women wear. They scrutinize how they look. They scrutinize how they speak. And I had to be able to get my points across without being a distraction in myself. And I knew that, you know, when I tried to brief Trump before, I was like, who's this middle-aged woman with this weird accent? No, thank you. It wasn't George W. Bush or, you know, someone like Barack Obama who were going to, you know, give you a hearing. And I was going to have millions of people listening, not just members of Congress who were looking at me thinking, what the heck are you doing here? So I was going to have to explain myself. And that's, you know, how we end up, here we are full circle talking to you, because I had to say who I was, why I was there.
Yeah.
Why am I this person with this accent? How did I get there? And what right do I have to tell them the truth about what had happened? I had to remove all distractions. I had to take away all of the layers so that only my voice telling the truth could be heard. And, you know, so I focused on the job, and it was only really after everything that I stood back and thought, oh my goodness, what just happened there?
Yeah. Because
it was just one of those, the world suddenly shifted. And it wasn't just the historic moment of the impeachment of a president for doing something, you know, very dramatic. And of course, that's the first impeachment. Second time he tries to, you know, stage a coup. And we're still in all of this right now in the United States. It's just all still going on. And I realized, you know, I was having to sort of step up also in defense of democratic institutions and, you know, the health of American democracy. Sometimes you just got to stand up and speak out.
Yeah, it was quite bizarre how things seemed to move, and there was, and you could see this in other areas as well. You could talk about the UK right now, but how certain decisions can be made and certain matters take effect, and there seems to be this apathy that things aren't being changed, things aren't being challenged, things that the voices be sound. And in the UK, we've got the Good Law Project that is doing quite a good. And we've had the guys on the podcast talking about the work they do to hold government to account.
Yeah. But honestly, everyone can do that. Look, and we're seeing now, we've got nurses on strike, you've got railway workers, you've got the representatives of the unions, but you've got individuals doing something. People have got to stand up and be counted. And, you know, that, I think, you know, one of the many reasons that I did this, but it's deeply rooted in my own experience of growing up in an environment where people had to take responsibility for themselves, otherwise nothing would happen. That's like the levelling up agenda now as well in the UK. Don't wait for the government. Figure out, you know, how you can do things for yourselves, how people can pull together. And when I was growing up in the northeast of England, there was still enough of that infrastructure of opportunity I'm talking about, but mutual self-help, you know, communal assistance, people helping out their friends, neighbours and family. And it used to be centred in the workplace. You know, when Dad had his you know, vegetable garden, if there were people at the hospital who were, you know, not doing very well and they needed some extra food, Dad would take the food and share them. And the local allotments would do that. They would raise money, you know, for things. People are always doing that. This was kind of the ultimate expression of this, just sort of standing up and saying, look, this is wrong.
Yeah.
And I also at that point thought to myself, well, what have I got to lose? I was already in my 50s. I've had a great career. I can't complain about it. Okay, what are they going to do? These guys send me back to Bishop Auckland? Great, fine. I love being back in Bishop Auckland. That's it. Okay, I've had a good ride here. But I'm not going to just let these guys throw this country down the drain here, because that's really what they were doing. And I think that's how everybody should feel now. Right now, I mean, people are running the United States and the United Kingdom into the ground because they're putting themselves first rather than kind of thinking about the larger groups around them. And when people put their own person and party before everything else, before the country, you've got a real problem. That's been happening in both countries.
Yeah, I think we're missing something in the fit and proper person.
That's right.
Evaluation of people who take public office.
That's right. Yeah.
Attention we're taking to actually.
And people taking it for the wrong reasons. I mean, Derek Foster for me is a sort of epitome of somebody doing something for the right reasons. It wasn't about personal power and money and influence.
Well, looking at what has happened to you, and I was just reading your this is a snapshot of things you've been doing, and I get tired just looking at your schedule. But your book was published 2021.
That's right, October 2021. Yeah.
which is this nice little number here, which I think is brilliant. We haven't really talked about the fact that the phrase itself, which is the title of the book, "There is nothing for you here." Your dear father Alf referenced that to you.
Yeah, he said, "There's nothing for you here, pet," in 1984.
Missing the pet.
I was,
I think the pet should go on.
I do too, but the American publishers were like, they'll think it's about cats and dogs, and I was like, oh.
Yeah, it'll go in the wrong section of the library.
The wrong section of the library, exactly. Yeah.
So
that was a particular snapshot of time of 1984. 90% youth unemployment at the time. I mean, for school leavers, because people, it took them forever to find, a job or something else. Yeah. The 10% was somebody who had, going off to college or vocational training, apprenticeship. I mean, eventually people would find it, but it would take a really long time. And he was basically saying, look, if you've got a chance to go to college, don't think about sticking around here. If there's nothing for you here, pet, you've got a chance, go off and do something. But I mean, I always had the intention of coming back, which has been, kind of a bit tricky to find those pathways. So in a way, I am coming back by, trying to bring things back to County Durham. And in my head, when I was writing the book, I was thinking, I've been away a long time, and I want to put, the kind of place on the map for other people to see that there was something. There was something for people that actually, and there is something, for people now, and we can build it ourselves. And I want to figure out how I can give back, to the region that set me off on this path.
I think you can say without a shadow of a doubt, Fiona, you have most definitely helped put the Northeast on the map.
It's always been on the map, honestly. And I mean, there's so many amazing things happen in the Northeast. It's just people sometimes are just not aware of it. You need to shout it out. Yeah.
The book was published back in 2021. You've been on a book and lecture tour for
the best part of the year. Yeah, I mean, more than a year now. Yeah.
You've been on Desert Island Discs, which I thought was fabulous, because I'll tell you,
pinnacle of achievement, honestly.
No, I love that. I love that more than anything else. The song that you took forward, because I played that song to death when I was the same age as you, from the other Matt Johnson.
This is the day. Yeah, what a great song.
I had that and played it to death. So
yeah, it was actually the one that kept making me think every day could be this is the day when things fall into place, right?
Exactly.
It's not like don't get disturbed. Like, yeah, that was yesterday. This is the day.
But it was. I mean, that in itself, I think, as a soundtrack to, and then you've got Ghost Town from the Specials, and
oh God, and Terry Hall.
That was so sad to hear that he passed. You've also done the BBC Reith Lecture, and you've been honoured with the position of Chancellor of Durham University. Which, congratulations! It's
thank you.
Fabulous appointment. With that particular role, are you shaping a sort of plan for that? Do you have this is going to sound like a really basic question, I should know the answer, but what does the Chancellor do? What is that job?
Well, I mean, it's largely a ceremonial and ambassadorial role. I mean, a lot of presiding or helping to preside, doing all of this yourself, obviously, over graduations. But I think it's also, a platform, to advocate for education. And obviously for the students of Durham, and Durham is one of the leading educational institutions in the United Kingdom, not just in the United States, but also Durham itself, the university set up in the Durham Castle in the heart of the region by the bishops of Durham, to basically foster more intellectual endeavour, research, and sort of thinking about the future. And higher education is under question at the moment. And I'd like to at least to kind of think about how I can work with the university and the rest of the region. And we've got Newcastle University and Sunderland and Teesside, and then the colleges in Middlesbrough and Bishop Auckland and elsewhere, about how to make education really real for people again, because it's a lifelong process of education. I've learned that. And back in the day, Durham University lecturers would go and talk to the miners and talk to schools. There's still a lot of that happening. And just how I could play a role in trying to enhance that and to emphasize how important education is. So I'm kind of thinking, and obviously I will take the lead from people at the university. I mean, they've already got a lot going on, and I'm just trying to figure out. I haven't really started yet about how I might take that forward.
That's going to be exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. I know that some of the guys that I've worked with in Southwest Durham News, Archie, you've spoken to as well.
Yes, and others that I've spoken to. Yes, that's been great.
So I'm, on my own way to be able to put something back in those areas. Finally, you've given me a huge amount of your time, and I appreciate you've got a very busy day today.
Yeah, I've actually got to go and talk to another group very quickly now, so I'm sorry about that. I mean, it's always that kind of one of these things that, you find yourself trapped in back-to-back things, because look, it is really important trying to do, what Derek Foster did. I mean, I always kind of felt to myself, I owe it to people like Derek Foster to do the same thing. Get out there and just encourage people to say, look, if I can do it, honestly, you can too. And where there's a will, there's a way, but there also has to be the opportunity given to people. And the opportunity isn't just saying, hey, you can do this. It's trying to figure out how you can do this, that wherewithal, the infrastructure for that opportunity. Because so many opportunities came along that I couldn't take because there wasn't the means to take advantage of them, like Oxford, back in the day, because of all the barriers to entry that were there. How do you think about removing these kinds of barriers for people?
Yeah, and not least of all, you were not put off by the failures of not getting into Oxford or being knocked back on certain things.
Exactly.
Told you had a funny accent or you were dressed in a particular way. It's pushing through that and actually having the confidence in yourself to make the success that you have. Dr. Fiona Hill, this has been a real pleasure. Very much enjoyed talking to you. If it wasn't for the fact that I know that you've got to find out about our time, I probably would have bored you, but I could have listened and talked.
Well, I'd be very happy to chat to you, and I'm really thrilled to be able to do this. And let's find another time to have another chat later. Perhaps once I get properly installed in the role of Chancellor, because one of the goals is to help put the spotlight not just onto the university but on the region, because I mean that's obviously the university is really at the heart of all of that, as it has been for a very long time now, going back to the 19th century.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, been a delight, and I'm sure there's a huge amount of insight being drawn from the conversation, which I'm sure our audience are going to love. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much, David. Really great to talk to you, and to everybody else as well. Just my very best wishes.